I'm Haze Hartwig. This is Bamboo, Vancouver's property management and investment podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to the show. Today what we're going to be discussing is essential landlord skills. And this is going to be a high overview, of course. But whether you are a DIY, do-it-yourself property owner or a professional, there are certain skills that you definitely need to have in your toolbox. So the first one, and of course it's the bread and butter of any tenant's placement, is the tenant screening. Now there's many ways to do this, and some of them that you want to do for sure is contacting the previous landlords and verifying their employment. Now, you can ask very little with the employment, but what you want to do is make sure to slow down and try and listen very carefully and listen to that high or low tone example. So if you call in and say, "Hi, we're just doing a background check to see if Joe works there," and they're like, "Oh yeah, Joe," and it sounds like they're quite bubbly about that, that's usually a fairly good sign, as most of the time a tenant will put in their employer or their superior's name and number. Whereas if they're like, "Ugh, Joe," then that's kind of something that you want to take note of and just listen carefully to the tone that's there. Now, there's other methods to look up a tenant. You are allowed to Google them and that. Technically, due to the privacy laws, social media is not supposed to be used to check a background of a tenant. Namely for the fact that whatever's presented on social media may just be for the show, so it might not be accurate. But on a technical level, due to the privacy laws, you're not supposed to use social media. Now, when you are calling the landlord to ask them about how the tenant is, some questions that you may want to ask is things like, how long have they lived there? And do they party, smoking, messy? Do they damage the place? Generally, how do they treat the unit? Because obviously this will sort of shed some light onto how they're going to treat your unit. And obviously you want to make sure that you don't have someone who's going to bash it up. You also want to look into why they're moving and ask them if they're aware. And what this will help you learn is, did they give proper notice, or is there something going on there that you maybe want to be aware of? So make sure that you ask when they're moving and if they're aware of that. And ultimately, it never hurts to just ask point blank, if you could rent to them again, would you? Now, there's heaps of screening questions. In fact, we could do a whole show on them, and probably will, to be perfectly honest. But a couple of the other major tips that you want to remember for screening your tenants is to throw out a couple of red herrings. Get the address wrong, something simple like that. And this will help you maybe determine whether it's actually the landlord or if it's just a friend. And the reason being here, I say the address in particular, is because we all know how to get to our friend's house, but most of the time we couldn't tell you the exact address. So if it's just a friend, it might help rattle that a little bit, and you can find out if you're actually speaking to the landlord or there's something else going on. And ultimately, listen to your gut. We've gone through years of evolution. Your gut feeling keeps you out of trouble and keeps you safe. So if for some reason your belly is not agreeing with whatever the paper is, all the information and all that, there's just something irking you, listen to it, because there's a good likelihood that there's a reason for that, and you should definitely listen. One of the second things that you want to be fairly proficient at is the lease agreements. These agreements that come from our government, the RTB1 form, which is to set up the outset of a tenancy, are missing some fairly important items, such as smoking rules, pets, and marijuana cultivation, for just a few of them. So you just want to make sure that everything is laid out prior to the tenancy, and so that everybody knows in clear, normal terms what's going on with that. So you do want to maybe look up some terms, other than the ones that I just said, of course, online, and maybe just set out there's certain things, because the RTB1 form is fairly weak, in my opinion, on protecting the landlord, because it's silent on a lot of issues that probably should be mentioned. You do have to make sure, though, that you're careful not to impede human rights, of course, or have any items that are unenforceable, such as restricting visitors and things like this. So you do want to make sure that you are on top of it with your lease agreements. A third item that you're going to want to make sure that you're fairly proficient at is property maintenance. Now, we all have a little bit of elbow grease in us, so go ahead and use it. It doesn't mean that you need to be like Bob Villa. Did I just age myself? Probably did, but anyways, you don't need to be Bob Villa. But you can do a lot of simple things, such as changing a light switch or even changing your light bulbs to LED, so that you never have to argue about whether the lights are out or not, or were they, whichever. And you can also learn a lot of the simple stuff from YouTube. So go ahead and flip around on YouTube. You might be able to save yourself a couple of bucks, and hell, you'll learn something. You can use it in your own place. You will also want to build a book for the things you can't or don't want to do. Some examples of this are a handyman, plumber, appliance repair, etc. This will also save you the stress for when something does go wrong, because you already know who you're going to call. It's a bit of a nightmare when somebody calls you up and say there's a flood happening and you are thinking about going and pricing out plumbers. It would be significantly better if you've already priced out one and you know who your go-to plumber is. You're calling that company. That's who's going to solve this problem. So this will take a lot off of your plate, and basically it'll set you up for the future. Preparation is always a great thing to have in property management. A fourth point is tenant communication. I cannot stress how much tenant communication is a huge skill that is often overlooked, that can save everybody, both tenants, both landlords, time and money. So you want to make sure that everything that is said can be reproduced and is clear. If you're not sure of something, ask. Make sure that it's completely crystal clear as to what is going on, and do ask the tenant as well. Do you understand? Is this clear? Something along these lines. Not in a hot fashion, not like you're arguing, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And as I said earlier, you do want to make sure that you can reproduce whatever you say. So email is definitely one of the more preferred methods, especially since it's time-stamped. And you can make sure to send a follow-up email after a phone conversation. Generally speaking, if things go a little further, the RTB, they're okay with text generally, the screen captures, but an email is definitely the preferred method. The thing with the tenant communication as well is that it goes both ways. So all of these horror stories in rentals usually come from communication. So if it's not your forte, you may want to consider using a property manager. It'll take the stress out of it. It also gives that barrier between you and the tenant. If you guys don't get along, something's not going right, it might be a good way just to have a clear head that just knows the rules, follows it, and doesn't really have a horse in the race. So you may want to consider a property manager if you're not very strong with communications or you have a temper. Additionally, you want to make sure that you have good problem-solving skills and essentially customer service skills. Your tenant is paying top dollar for your unit, and you want to make sure that they have a good experience. This will also benefit you in the sense that they'll want to stay longer, because if people are having a good time, they generally want to stay somewhere. So when you're dealing with a tenant, try to be a little bit more empathetic and do try to understand where they're coming from. It's a good idea to try to work with the tenant instead of coming in guns blazing and just upset and trying to fight everybody. I mean, we hear these terrible stories about this terrible landlord or terrible tenant all the time. And most of the time it does always come back to communication and empathy and just trying to solve a problem. I mean, there's certain situations, of course, where it's just not going to work. You know, sometimes people are just hot under the collar, or even when that happens, maybe just put a pause on it, put a pin in it and just say, look, we can't deal with this right now, and I'll call you back in 40 minutes or something. Because then cooler heads will prevail, and you can probably solve the problem without really having to take it further and to go through the whole RTB process and basically just not having a good relationship with your tenant, because you are in this together overall. So you do want to make sure that you come at this from an empathetic and service sort of standpoint, as opposed to just someone who's paying you money and you taking it and ignoring each other, basically. So I'm not saying that you have to be your best friends here, but when it comes down to it, if there's a problem, figure out how to solve it, and hopefully everyone will come out on it happy, and you'll have a good long-standing relationship with your tenant, and they will never move, basically, and you won't have a vacancy, which will pay you off in the long run. The final one that we're going to cover is legal compliance and financial management. You want to make sure that you stay up to date on this. The RTB, the Residential Tenancy Branch, has a tendency to roll out new rules quietly. One of the examples of this is when the vacate clause was expunged from the rules. A lot of landlords did not know this. So when the end of the tenancy was coming up, they figured that March 31st, that's when the tenant has to leave. We don't have a new contract, and out they go. That was abolished, and it automatically turns to month rent. This was caused because some landlords were trying to get around the rules of the maximum rent increase, and were essentially trying to pop people's rents like $500 from one year to the next, which of course is quite heavy on a tenant and not really that ethical, to be perfectly honest. So you do want to make sure that you are up to date with the legal parts of tenancy and being a landlord. And again, with the financial part, one of the things that's come up recently is that now the deposits actually, for the first time in a very, very long time, accrue interest. Some landlords don't know this. So when a tenant is about to move out in a year or two, some landlords might not be aware that that damage deposit will be damage deposit plus interest. And of course, this may end up starting a conflict and just end your tenancy that probably was otherwise no problem in a problem. So you don't really want to end off on a terrible situation, do you? Exactly. So make sure that you keep up with your legal compliance as well as your financial. And one of the best ways to do is just periodically stop by the Residential Tenancy Branch website from the government and just see if there's any bulletins there. It's just a good thing to do, and that way it'll keep you on top of stuff. So thank you very much for joining us. If you found anything useful, please be sure to subscribe and share this with any of your friends. We'll be back in 2 weeks to cover the market stats as well as anything that's going on in the property management market in Greater Vancouver. My name is Haze Hartwig. This has been Bamboo, Vancouver's property management and investment podcast.